some of the things you brought up? Because I agree that affiliation with Al-Qaeda is a red herring, and this is an ideology that spreads, as you pointed out. It's massively enabled by the internet, and whether someone has ever spoken to Osama bin Laden or has ever received an email from Al-Qaeda, they can be operating under the same ideology. I'm not sure how much of what you said has addressed my central concern. I will fully concede that there are other ways to think yourself into suicidal terrorism. I did not know there were any Christian suicide bombers, and it doesn't surprise me, but the thing that I want to point out is that there's a real difference between how easily you can morph the ideology of martyrdom and jihad within Islam to this kind of behavior, and how much more work you have to do in Christianity as it is currently practiced, and in Buddhism. Now, you mentioned the Zen Buddhists, the kamikaze pilots of World War II. I can easily describe why Zen Buddhism, in combination with Shinto and Japanese military chauvinism, could get you an ideology that was very martial and justify that behavior, and why the Tibetan Buddhists are a very unlikely candidate population for that behavior, given what they believe about compassion. Among Buddhists, one of the real problems with Zen is that it does not emphasize compassion at all, or very much, and you can get this very kind of militant samurai sort of, the sword of wisdom kind of ethos, and without much practical application of compassion. So I'm still arguing for theological consequences of ideas, and I just think that there's an obscurantism at the heart of the way you're talking about this that troubles me, because this is what I think. If the Quran was exactly the way it is, but it contained a single extra line, and that line read, if you see a red-haired woman on your doorstep at sunset, cut her head off. Okay, just imagine a text like this that comes down through the ages that contains a line like that. I can tell you what kind of world we would live in. We would live in a world where red-haired women would be found murdered in the Muslim world. We'd open the New York Times and we would hear that there were 20 heads found in a bag, and they were all red-haired women. We would also live in a world in which apologists for Islam would look at that behavior and say, that has nothing to do with Islam. There was a news story yesterday about a Mormon man who killed his wife, and she had red hair. Many of those women who were found whose heads were found in the bag in Baghdad were not actually redheads, but some were strawberry blonde. We would hear about women who were shot and not decapitated, and decapitation is the only thing that is sanctioned in the Quran. I mean, this is the kind of gymnastics we would be faced with. And the basic fact about the Quran, as it is with so many other books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and there's nothing worse than Leviticus and Deuteronomy as far as I can tell, but people ignore them, as Richard pointed out. The basic problem with the Quran is that it really does preach hatred and fear of the infidel far more eloquently than it preaches anything else. And that is a problem we are living with, and no amount of casuistry is going to get us around that until we find some way of empowering the forces of moderation in the Muslim world. And I would agree with you, in a hostage negotiation, you don't tell them that your religion is bullshit. I think we are engaged in a very different hostage negotiation now, talking about the role of science and intellectual honesty.
Let me just say about the kamikaze. There's a book called When Cherry Blossoms Fall. They were not militant. There was not much of a militant ideology. They were basically German romantics.
Read Zen at War and Zen War Stories.
This is their diaries. This is their diaries.
Can I
But
comment on
on
the kamikazes for a moment, just because it's in the moment, and I know my esteemed colleague here. He's always trying to. I'll hand to you in just a moment. Aren't we forgetting a couple of things here? That, for example, the American admirals in the Pacific, once they saw that Japanese pilots were, instead of firing missiles and bombs to the ships, started flying their planes into the ships, they knew that there was a turn in the war at that point, because as effective as that was as an act of war, they knew that Japan's capacity to wage war was on a dramatic decline. Because had that been, it was not the first choice for Japan to engage kamikaze bombers. And so if we go to Islam, there's a question I haven't heard asked yet. Because we're looking at suicide bombings as some kind of intrinsically noble exercise within the paradigm and abhorrent from the outside. But would there be suicide bombings if the Islamic community had their own air force and tanks? I don't think so. They would be invoking the military machines that the rest of the West has available to itself.
And they say so quite specifically.
Okay.
No, I would say I wouldn't be quite that sanguine. There wouldn't be suicide bombings, perhaps, but this notion of martyrdom, either you believe in martyrdom as a genuine metaphysical principle or you don't. If you do, it has certain behavioral and logical consequences. Get the U.S. out of this. Look at the war between Iran and Iraq. The Iranian mothers were sending their teenage sons out to clear minefields with their lives, thinking they were going to get to paradise and get the whole family in after them. We were not, this was not Iran against the great Satan. This was not an expression of their entanglement with Israel. This was, I mean, how do you get a mother to celebrate the suicidal atrocities of her children? She has to believe something. Now, more often than not, I'm with Weinberg, who thinks she has to believe something religious. Now, you can get me some kind of Marxist ideology hammered into her head that may get her to feel consoled by that behavior, but martyrdom is good enough, and martyrdom is very well subscribed. And so whether they're willing to blow up nukes or just not be deterred in a mutually assured destructive sort of way, the way the Soviet Union was, that's really what I'm worried about. I'm worried about a world in which we wake up and we see the psychological equivalents of the 19 hijackers armed with long-range nuclear weapons. And then we have to think, well, are these really rational actors? I mean, are they as pragmatic as Scott says? Or are these guys really willing to hit the wall at 400 miles an hour? I think they're telling us they're willing to hit the wall. Many of them are hitting the wall. I think as a rhetorical device, that's pretty persuasive. So I'm inclined to take them seriously.